Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Mem Hey. We're going to get started from a quick review of the Mishnah. We started the Mishnah at the bottom of the daf with Parim, Elim, and Kvasim. The bulls, the rams, and the sheep are not ma'akvim ze et ze. If you don't have all of them, it's okay. You can bring the others. At least that's the way we understand it now. So the Gemara asked, which Parim and Kvasim and Elim are we talking about? So they said, Elim adechag. If we're talking about the ones on Sukkot, it can't be those, because the ones on Sukkot, it says kamishpat kamishpatam, they have to be done exactly as it says. So it can't possibly be that. Ella, so it must be, or maybe it is, the Rosh Chodesh, va'atzeret to Chumash HaPkudim. Chumash HaPkudim is Sefer Bamidbar, where they counted the people. So maybe it's the korbanot that you bring on the new moon and on Shavuot. Also, it's the same ones you bring on Pesach. Okay, for this purpose, I'm now going to share my screen and we're going to follow along on the study guide. This is going to help. So in the study guide, we're going to see the psukim in Bamidbar Perek Kafchet. It's the second section on your page. And it says there, on Yom HaBikurim, on Shavuot, okay, it says it also by Rosh Chodesh, but I brought the ones by Shavuot. You'll see because we're going to need this psukim later. V'ikravtem olah l'reach nichoach l'Hashem, parim b'nei bakar shnayim. So you're supposed to bring korbanot olah. What do you bring for your korbanot olah? 2 parim, 2 bulls. Okay, and here there's a chart which charts out exactly which korbanot you bring which times. Specifically the ones we're discussing today, not all the holidays. But 2 bulls, 1 ram, and 7 sheep. Okay, shiva kvasim. So 2, 1, and 7. And there's a series imachad l'chatad. Okay, if you want to know, that's another. Okay, these are korbanot olah, as I put in the chart. The 3 of these are olah, and you bring 2, 1, and 7. So maybe that's what they mean. The parim, the elim, and the kvasim listed here. What's the problem? Elim dehecha. Which elim? Okay, there are no elim here. If you say you don't have to bring all the bulls, you don't have to bring all the sheep, I get it, but you don't have to bring all the rams. There is only 1 ram, so there's no such thing. Idahanu, right? If you're talking about these, the ayilhu, there's only 1 ayil, there's only 1 ram. It doesn't make any sense to say that. Ida atzeret de Torat Kohanim, well, maybe we're talking about Shavuot in Sefer Vayikra, where it lists a different set of korbanot. There it talks about, in Vayikra chapter 23, where it talks about all the holidays, talks about different details. It also mentions sacrifices, specifically in the korban for Shavuot. Why? Because there it talks about the special korban of the Shtei Alechem. Okay, what we saw in Bamidbar, chapter 28, that's what we call the musafim, the extra korbanot that are brought on the holidays. But in Vayikra, it's specifically a korban that's brought on Shavuot. It says, V'ikravtem al alechem, you should bring with the bread, shivat kvasim tmimim, also 7 sheep, b'nei shana, upar ben bakar achad, and 1 bull, and elim shnayim, 2 rams. So now we have it, those are the rams that must be, right? Ida atzeret de Torat Kohanim, so maybe it's those, but havayaktiv behu, but what does it say there? Yihiyu. Olah Hashem. These will be. Now, whenever it has the word Yihiyu, what do we know that means? It's essential. And the Mishnah says this isn't essential. So it can't be that. Okay, so we're going to have to go back to La'olam Atzeret de Torat Kohanim. We're going to go back and say, fine. We're going to explain that it does work. And it is the one of Torat Kohanim, the one in Vayikra. V'hachi kamar, and this is how to read it. Lo elim de Torat Kohanim ma'ach ve'le'ayel de Chumash HaPkudim v'lo al de Chumash HaPkudim ma'ach ve'le'elim de Torat Kohanim. What it's saying is this, okay? That the elim, the 2 elim on Shavuot, aren't the ones special ones you bring for Shavuot, aren't ma'akev, the 1 al you're supposed to bring for the musaf. So if you don't bring the ones with the Shtei Alechem, you can still bring the ones for the musaf. And if you don't bring the ones for the musaf, you could still bring the ones with the Shtei Alechem. Okay, and that's how they explain it. Okay, that seems to work. But now we have a problem, because then we assume that the Mishnah means when it says hapalim, v'ha'ilim, v'akvasim are not ma'akev zeh, we mean the set of musafim is not ma'akev the set with the Shtei Alechem, and the set with the Shtei Alechem is not ma'akev the set with the musafim. But elaparim, and it doesn't mean, now what does that mean? It doesn't mean you can choose to bring 1 out of the 2 elim, or 1 out of the 2 bulls, or 1 out of the 7 kvasim. Okay, because it means each set isn't ma'akev the other, but then within each set it would be. But we don't say that about the bulls, because elaparim da'afilu hadadi lo ma'akve. We know that the bulls aren't necessary. Okay, we're going to see this in a drasha later, and it's also pretty clear from what Rabbi Shimon says in the Mishnah, because Rabbi Shimon had said, if you have a lot of bulls, you bring the bull with its libations, okay? And we're going to see that that's not even specifically Shavuot, that's just in general. But we're going to see later with Shavuot, it seems very clear that you can bring one bull without the other. So now we're stuck because we're going to explain parim in one way, that the parim aren't essential. And we're going to say that means one isn't ma'akev the other. You can bring one without the other. And when it says elim, it means, well, you have to bring these two, but you don't have to bring those two and the other one, or you can bring that one without bringing the other two. That's a little bit weird, right? Elim dahachu is a lo ma'akev, right? So we're going to now say the parim means you can have one but without the other. The elim means, well, you have to have both elim in the Shavuot with the shtei lechem, but those two aren't ma'akev the one of the musaf. That's a little bit strange, but the Gemara says, right? So again, elim dahachu de lo ma'akev, but inu ma'akev, but right now, so within there, they're not ma'akev, but they are ma'akev each other. Anyway, they say tana mile katane. Yeah, we actually are going to end up reading this Mishnah that the Mishnah is basically talking about the parim in one way. This bull doesn't mess up the other bull. In other words, you bring one bull, it's fine. But when it comes to the elim, it actually means those two aren't makev the one, and the one isn't makev the other two. Okay, and that way we resolve the Mishnah. It's a little bit complicated, but it works. Now we're going to bring up a pasuk in Yechezkel. From there, we're going to get off on all sorts of pasukim in Yechezkel. Now, in Yechezkel, in the chapters in the 40s, the mid-tie 40s in Yechezkel, there's a lot of psukim that are kind of problematic and seem to contradict things in the Torah. And they also seem to be discussing some future in the time of the third temple. So it says here, Ubayom HaChodesh, on Rosh Chodesh, par ben bakar tami, v'shisha kvasim v'al tmimim yiyuz. So bring a bull, bring 6, okay, I want you to look here at the Musaf Rosh Chodesh. You're supposed to bring 2 bulls. And then it says bring 6 sheep and ayal tmimim. The only one that works is the ram, because there's one ram. And there's one ram in the Torah. But the Kvasim, it says 7, not 6. Par matam ulamar. Why does it say par? It should be parim, 2 bulls. Lefishan emar b'Torah parim, right? So it says in the Torah bulls, plural. Uminayin shim lo matzah shnayim maybe echad. Now, how do you know? And here's where we get it, that if you don't have 2, you can actually bring 1. Talmud lamar, par. The reason why it says par in Yechezkel is to say, if you only have 1, you can bring 1. And that's how we learned that law that was so obvious to them before, but we hadn't seen it yet. Shisha kvasim matam ulamar. Why does it say 6 then? It says in the Torah 7. How do we know if you didn't find 7, you could bring 6? Talmud lamar shisha. That's why it says shisha. Just like the parim, you could bring 6 if you want. Minayin shem lo matzah shisha yavi chamisha. How do you know if you didn't find 6, you could bring 5? Or chamisha yavi arba'ah. If you didn't have 5, you could bring 4. Or arba'ah yavi shlosha. If you only have 4, if you didn't have 4, you could bring 3. Or shlosha yavi shnayim. Or if you had 3, you could bring 2. If you didn't have 3, you could bring 2. V'afilu echad, and even you could bring just 1. Talmud lamar. Okay, this is a next pasuk. There it says lakvasim asher tasigado. Okay, the pasuk reads like this. Okay, bayom hachodesh, on Rosh Chodesh, bring par ben bakar tmimim, shisha kvasim va'ayal tmimim yiyu. That we explained already. Notice the word yiyu appears here. We're going to get back to that. And then the next pasuk says ve'efala par ve'efala ayil. We're going to come back to that soon. You give a measurement for the par and the measurement for the ayil. That seems to be talking about the mincha. Yasel mincha. It says it mincha explicitly. V'lakvasim, and also to the sheep, asher tasig yado, according to what you can afford. So what do we say here? Lakvasim asher tasig yado, for the sheep, according to what you can afford. From there we learn that even if you can only afford 1, you could bring 1. We mean obviously the community, this is a communal offering. Okay, so now they say, wait a minute, me'achar dichtiv hachi. Once we said that all you have to bring is 1, and we learn it from those words there, that whatever you can afford, shisha kvasim lamali, then why do you need to say 6? If you could bring 1, you didn't even need to say 6. Obviously, I could bring 6 if I don't have if I don't have all 7. If I could bring only 1, I can obviously bring 6 instead of 7. So, the reason why they wrote 6 is because they're saying you don't have to bring all 7, but you should try really hard as best as you can to bring as many as you can. Okay. Now we're going to say, Minayin shema'akvin ze et ze. Now, how do we know that they're ma'akev ze et ze? Okay, it's a little hard to understand what we're talking about, so Rashi helps us out here. It's always a good trick. Minayin shema'akvin ze et ze, Rashi says, Im yesh lem parim shnayim, o kfasim shiva. What if you do have 2 bulls? Or what if you do have 7 sheep? It's not that you can't afford them. You have them. How do we know that you have to bring them all? Okay, you can't, if you have 7 sheep there and you didn't bring them all, then your korban's ruined. How do we know that? Talmud Lamal, Yehiyu. That's that word I said before. Pay attention. It says you in the pasuk means it has to be that way. Okay. Now that we've quoted some psukim Yechezkel to contradict, we're going to quote some the created problems which we resolved. We're going to quote some more issues in Yechezkel. Kol Amar Hashem Elokim. Barichon, they're all from the 40s, 40, 44, 46, 48. Okay, they're. I'm not going to quote the source for each one, but you can look it up. Barishon be'echad lechodesh, on the first month, on the first day of the month, tikach, right, the first of Nisan, tikach par ben bakal tamim v'chiteta et hamikdash. Bring a pal and chiteta et hamikdash. Now, what is chiteta? From the language of chatat. So they say chatat olahi. Let's go back to our chart. What does it say in the chart? What are you supposed to bring on Rosh Chodesh? You're supposed to bring 2 bulls for what? For a korban olah. So now it says bring 1 bull and for a chatat. So they say chatat olahi. It's supposed to be an olah. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, parasha zo Eliyahu atid l'darsha. Rabbi Yochanan says, I don't understand this. When Eliyahu comes, he's going to explain it to me. Rav Ashi Amal, Rav Ashi says, I have an answer. I'll tell you what he's talking about. Miluim hikrivu b'imei Ezra, kederech shekrivu b'imei Moshe. Now, let's go back to b'imei Moshe. There were the Miluim, the Yimei Miluim, in Parshat Shmini, the very beginning, starts out, Vahi bayom Shmini, on the 8th day of the Miluim. Okay, chapter 9. Moshe calls to Aaron and his sons, Vayomer al Aaron. He speaks to Aaron, he says, Kach lecha egel ben bakar lechatat, va'ay lo lat mimim va'akrev lefnei Hashem. He says, take an egel ben bakar for a sin offering, and an ayah lo olah. So now, what did he take? An egel for a sin offering. So now they say, in the time of Ezra, he did that as well. Now, some people say that Yechezkel, he came before Ezra. He was prophesizing that this is what Ezra was going to do. Some people say he was actually talking about the 3rd temple, and then Ezra heard his prophecy, and based on that, did it when the 2nd temple was built. Okay, so it was a special sacrifice for the dedication of the temple. Tanya Namiyachi is a brighter to support this answer of Rav Ashi, who explains this very nicely. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, parasha zo atid Eliyahu atid l'darsha. Same thing as later we saw Rabbi Yochanan say. Here it comes up in a Tanaitic source. And Amar lo Rabbi Yossi, right? So we don't understand it. Eliyahu will explain it. Amar lo Rabbi Yossi, miluim krivu b'mei Ezra kederech shekrivu b'mei Moshe. And basically, what we saw Rav Ashi said seems to be this Tanaitic opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Amar lo, Rabbi Yehuda then responds to him and says, Tanuach da'atcha she'inachta da'ati. Wow, thank you for calming me down about this and explaining it. Okay, now we're up to more contradictions or strange psukim in Sefer Yechezkel with explanations. V'chol nevela trefa. Okay, nevela and trefa. Nevela is an animal that dies on its own, wasn't slaughtered properly. Trefa is an animal that was sick and basically is not kosher because of that. Mina of umina be'ema, from birds or animals. Lo yochlu hakohanim. The kohanim can't eat. Okay, this is a little bit strange pasuk. Nobody can eat it. Why all of a sudden he's saying the kohanim can't eat it? No Jews can eat it at all. Kohanim de lo yochlu ha'Yisrael achle. Right. Well, it sounds like the kohanim can't eat it, but it sounds like Jews can eat nevela and trefa. You can imagine why. We're going to see later. People were very upset with this book. It makes it sound like the Torah is wrong, right? That Yechezkel is saying something completely contradictory to the Torah. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, again, Rabbi Yochanan says, Parasha zo Eliyahu atid l'darsha. Rabbi Yochanan, right, the great scholar, Rabbi Yochanan, he had nothing to say. He didn't know how to understand this. Ravina Amal, but many generations later, or a bunch of generations later, the truth is there's a few different Ravinas, not clear when he came, but Ravina says, okay, certainly in the previous sugya it was Rabbi Yochanan, which was early, and Rav Ashi is the end. Okay, Rav Ashi and Ravina are often put together, so I'm assuming it's the same Ravina. Many generations later, comes Ravina and he says, Kohanim itzri chalei. No, you need the Kohanim in the pasuk. Why? Well, the Jews, of course, they can't eat nevela and trefa, but you might have thought Kohanim could. Now, why? It's a very strange reason. You would have thought, Ho'il ve'ishtere malika legabayu, tishtere nami nevelu trefa kamashmalan. The Kohanim are allowed to eat birds that you did malika to. Remember, that's how you do birds in the temple. Now, they can only eat it in the temple. But because they're allowed to eat birds that were malika in the temple, where if you do malika outside the temple, it's called a nevela, that bird. Okay, it's not a kosher bird. So maybe you would think they don't have laws of nevela and trefa at all. And that's why Yechezkel needs to say, no, the Kohanim also have laws of nevela and trefa. And with that, he resolved the pasuk. Another pasuk. And this is what you should do on the 7th of the month, on that month of Nisan. Me'ish shall get from a person who made a mistake, or mipeti, from foolish behavior, v'chipartem tabayit, and clean out the house, or atone the house. So what is this talking about? Shiv'ah, now we think it means on the seventh day of the month of Nisan, but now they're going to say, no, that's not what it means at all. Shiv'ah, because what sacrifice are we talking about? There is no special sacrifice on the 7th of Nisan. Shiv'ah, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Elu, by the way, Rabbi Yochanan here has an explanation. Elu Shiv'ah Shvatim Shechatu'u V'af al pi she'ein ruba shel kahal. These are 7 tribes that sinned. They're a majority of the tribes, even though they're not a majority population-wise. Okay, they're smaller tribes and less than the full population of Israel, or the majority of the population of Israel. Chodesh im chidshu va'amar chelev mutao. Okay, if you learned Harayot, you might see where we're going to. This pasuk is basically telling about bring a korban for the paral and davar shel tzibur. When the court issues an erroneous ruling and says the chelev is mutar, and that they get from Chodesh, they made a chidush. They gave a new ruling, which was a completely wrong ruling. Me'ish shogeh umipeti melamed she'im. So what do we do with this ish shogeh umipeti? Ein chayavin ela halem davar im shigat ma'aseh. That's the criteria by which you bring a paral davar shel tzibur. You have to have the Beit Din taught the wrong thing, and then the people sinned according to that. They did a shigat ma'aseh. They thought it was okay because the Beit Din said it was okay, and then they acted upon it. So that's the ish who is shogeh umipeti. He actually made the mistake. He did the action. It's not enough if they just rule incorrectly. Milamed she'en chayavim sorry. Okay, we learned it. So now this is all about the paral and davar shel tzibur, and that's what it's teaching us. You need the court to rule incorrectly and the people to follow. Amarav Yuda Amarav. Okay, now we just have one last statement about Yechezkel, although we will go back to one pasuk. Amarav Yehuda Amarav Zachor oto ish l'tov v'Chanina ben Chizkiah shmo. Okay, this one rabbi Chanina ben Chizkiah, sometimes called Hanani ben Chizkiah. He was really, Rav says, I remember this person is a very special person. He actually was way before him, but meaning people have talked about him, like he was very special. He was in the generation after Hillel and Shammai. He's the one who was attributed to he wrote Megillat Ta'anit, which is a list of all sorts of days you shouldn't fast because good things happen to the Jewish people on those days. If it weren't for him, Sefer Yechezkel would have been buried, would have been taken out of the Tanakh because of all these contradictions. Because his words were contradicting what it said in the Torah. Ma'asa, what did he do? He went up with 300 jugs of oil to be able to light his candle and learn through the nights. And he sat up in the aliyah and he just darshaned it until he figured it all out. He just didn't sleep. Okay, it's not clear how long he didn't sleep for. I'm assuming 300 is an exaggerated number, but he went up and he basically sat there until he could figure out how to resolve these contradictions. Unfortunately, his resolutions are gone. We don't have them. We don't have any record of all the way he resolved these contradictions, although I imagine they filtered down into what we saw, at least in some of the psukim today, and they're just making mention of him on this daf, even though his Torah isn't in the daf. Amar Rabbi Shimon, parim merubim. Now we go back to Rabbi Shimon, so we're really going back to the Mishnah, although we're going to see in a minute, we're going to get back to Yechezkel. So Rabbi Shimon had said, if you have a lot of parim, but you don't have any libations, so basically don't bring all the parim where you don't have enough money for them, bring a par with its libations. Better that than bringing more bulls. So where do we get this from? Tanu Rabbanan, they bring a brayta that says, ve'efa la'par, ve'efa la'ayil, yaseh lemincha, ve'lakfasim asher tasigadeo, v'shemen hin le'efa. So this said how much you bring for the par, how much you bring, right? You bring a measure for the par, you bring a measure for the ram, and that's what you bring for the mincha, and for the sheep that, you can afford. And shemen, you also bring a hin for an ephah. So Amar Rabbi Shimon, if something doesn't jive in this pasuk again, what is it? V'chim yidat parim ve'elim echati, in ephah for the par and ephah for the ayil, but don't we know, right? Shlosha esronim lapar, shnei esronim la'ayil. You bring 2, right? 3 esronim for the par, for every par offering, 2 for the ram. So it's not an ephah and ephah, the same measurement. So what does he darshan? Ela she'im hayu lahem parim merubim v'lo hayu nisachim, yaviu par echad unisachav v'al yekruvu kulam b'lo nisachim. What it means by ephah lapar and ephah la'ayil means if you have a pal, it has to come with its measure, whatever that is, okay, whatever its libations are. But it has to come with its measure. And likewise, so that what we said is, if you had one par and you couldn't afford, if you could afford more, if you had if you had a lot of parim, but you didn't have nisachim, better to bring one par with the libations than to bring more bulls. And in Mayulahem Elim, also it says the same thing by Elim. Ifala pari fala ayil. If you have rams turning out amabet, Elim urubim, you had a lot of rams. V'lo ayalahem efatam, but you didn't have the measurement. Yavi, right, the libations, yavi uayil ve'efato. Bring the ram with its measurement of flour, right, of the mincha. V'lo yikruvu kulam below efot. And don't bring all these rams without their proper measure, right, without their mincha. And with that, we finished the discussion on the previous Mishnah. Now we're going to a new Mishnah. Matniti. Okay, Mishnah. Hapal v'ha'ilim v'kvasim v'asi'il ein makvin talechem. Now we have to go back to our sheet. We have to go back and see the psukim in the beginning of Vayikra here. Okay, we talk about you bring with the bread 7 sheep, 1 bull, and 2 rams. Okay, and then, just to be very clear, you also bring a Shiur Yizim for chatat, and you bring shnei kvasim for shlamim. These are the 2, we've learned about these before, the bread and the 2 loaves, right? We learned that each are ma'akev, meaning you need both sheep. You can't do one without the other. You need both loaves. You can't do one without the other. Today we're going to talk about what if you only have the loaves and not the sheep? What if you have the sheep and not the loaves? But what's clear in the Mishnah from the beginning is that these extra korbanot that you bring in the beginning, in verse 18 in chapter 23 of Vayikra, the 7 sheep and the par and the 2 rams, and the Shiur Yizim lechatat, ein ma'akvin et halechem. If you don't have them, you can still bring the bread. And if you have the bread, v'lo halechem ma'akvan, and if you don't have the bread, you can bring those without the bread. Okay, even though it says bring them with the bread, we're going to get to this later and see how they darshan that. Halechem, now we're going to have a machloka between Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas. Halechem ma'akev et hakvasim, ve'en hakvasim ma'akvim et halechem divrei Rabbi Akiva. I made a chart of this down at the bottom of the page. So Rabbi Akiva says, the bread is ma'akev the sheep, but the sheep are not ma'akev the bread. Again, we're not talking about the 7 sheep, we're talking about the 2 that come for korban shlamim. All the other korbanot we discussed, okay, the parim, elim, and kvasim, the 7, and the 1 and the 2 of the parim and the elim, they're all ola. Shiur Yizim is the chatat, and the kvasim are shlamim, the 2 kvasim. So now, the lechem ma'akev et hakvasim, ve'en hakvasim ma'akvim et halechem. Rabbi Akiva says you don't need the kvasim. You can do the bread without it, but you can't do the kvasim, the sheep, without the bread. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas, lo, he says the exact opposite. Ela kvasim ma'akvim et halechem, v'halechem eino ma'akev et hakvasim. The sheep are more important. You have to bring the sheep. You can't bring the bread without the sheep, but you can bring the sheep without the bread. Okay, now what's his reason? Ben Nanas' reason is in the Mishnah. Well, we know in the desert they didn't bring the bread. How do we know they didn't bring the bread? Because the bread has to be brought. First of all, it says "Mimoshvotechem," from your dwelling places, bring bread. It has to be brought from the new crop of that year. The new crop is from Israel, not from the desert. So they obviously didn't bring the bread in the desert, but Ben Nanas is assuming they did bring the sacrifice, the kvasim. So what do you see here? In the desert, they went 40 years and they only brought the sheep those years, but without the bread. So avkan yikru kvasim below lechem. You see that the sheep can be brought without the bread. Amar Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon now comes in and says, halacha k'b'divrei Ben Nanas. So we assume he agrees with Ben Nanas. He says we paskin like Ben Nanas. However, he says, aval ena tam kitvarav, but he's completely wrong with his reason. Okay? The reason he gave before is just not true. Shekol amor b'chumash ha'pikudim karev b'midbar. He has this big statement and he says, remember we distinguish between the korbanot that are mentioned in Vayikra and the korbanot mentioned in Bamidbar. Well, the korbanot mentioned in Bamidbar, there's a good way to remember it. Bamidbar, okay, the desert. They were sacrificed in the desert, okay? All those musaf offerings, they were brought in the desert. But the ones mentioned in Sefer Vayikra, special korbanot that go with the holidays, in Vayikra chapter 23, were not brought in the desert at all. So don't say the sheep were brought in the desert and that's why, and the bread wasn't, and that's why we know the sheep are the ones that are more important, because even the sheep weren't brought, those 2 sheep. Okay, that's what he says. So then why does he hold like Ben Nanas? Well, he says, okay, and then he just finishes and he says, Mishaba'u la'aretz kirvu elu ve'elu. Only once they got to the land did they start bringing the sacrifices from Vayikra. Again, we're talking about the ones for the holidays are mentioned in Vayikra 23. So So then why do I agree with Ben Nanas that you can bring the sheep without the bread? Well, the kvasim permit themselves. What does that mean? When you sprinkle the blood, that permits the meat to be burned, and that permits the fatty parts to be burned and the meat to be eaten. The bread, what happens? You bring the sheep, that permits the bread. So that makes it sound like without sheep, there's no bread. Because the bread doesn't have any action you do to the bread. It's not like a mincha offering where you burn part and then the rest of it's permitted. No, you wave it with the sheep, and when you finish with the sheep, you can eat the bread when you sacrifice the sheep. So, therefore, Rabbi Shimon says it seems pretty clear it's the sheep that are necessary for the bread and not the bread for the sheep. Okay, now we're going to start with a bright. Tanu Rabbanat, the kravtem ala lechem. We're going to go back to this thing about the pasuk, the kravtem ala lechem, and why these other ones aren't ma'akev the bread. Okay, it says kravtem ala lechem. With the bread, you're supposed to bring all these sacrifices. It sounds like chova ala lechem. Right? It's responsible. You're obligated with the bread to bring these sacrifices. However, shivat pasim t'mimim, but then it says shivat pasim t'mimim, bring all these things. It doesn't say bring these on the bread. That would make it very clear. It's only with bread. It makes it sound in the pasuk like even if you don't have the bread. So why does it say on the bread? Milamed in the beginning of the pasuk. This comes and teaches you what we saw before about the desert. That only when you have bread are you obligated to bring these. The obligation to bring these doesn't kick in until you get into the land of Israel. Divrei Rabbi Tarfon. That's what Rabbi Tarfon says. The words Rabbi Akiva were in parentheses and they're not in any manuscript and everyone really takes them out. So assume this is Rabbi Tarfon continuing, or at least the Stam Mishnah. Yachol hein Stam Breita, sorry. Yachol hein kvasim amurim kan hein kvasim amurim b'chumash b'kudim. Now we're going to have another question. The 7 sheep mentioned here in Sefer Vayikra actually are the exact same amount as the 7 sheep mentioned in Sefer Bamidbar. So now there's this big question, and so by the way is the Sirizim. Right? There's one Sirizim there for Chatat, one Sirizim there. So the question is, are these the same? Or is there overlapping, meaning altogether you bring 7 sheep on Shavuot? Or is it 14? And you bring 7 with the bread and 7 with the musafim. So Amarta Kashamagia, it's a parim, right? So that's what they're saying. You might have thought, hein kvasim amurim kan, hein kvasim amurim b'chumash b'kudim. The 7 and the 7, it's the same one. They're just talking about the same 7 sheep. One is mentioned in Vayikra, one is mentioned in Bamidbar, but they're the exact same 7 sheep. You don't have to bring 14. But Amarta, no, we said can't be. Kshatamigia, it's a parim ve'elim enanhen. But you can't say the same about the Elim and Parim because in Bamidbar it says bring 2 Parim, 1 Ayil, and in Vayikra it says bring 1 Par and 2 Elim. Ela halalu ba'im biglal atzman, v'halalu ba'im biglal lechem. They say no. The Musaf ones are brought on their own, and the Shavuot ones are brought with the bread, and they're completely separate. And the fact that there's 7 and 7, it doesn't mean they're the same ones. Completely separate. V'nimtza ma she'amur b'chumash b'kudim karev b'midbar. And then they say, and we can get from here that the ones, the musafim, were brought in the desert, and the ones in Shavuot weren't, because again, they were brought with the bread, and when there's no bread, there's no sacrifice. Again, not nowadays, but when you couldn't bring bread because you hadn't even gotten into the land yet, so they didn't kick in yet that you're supposed to bring these sacrifices. Vidilma, but they say, wait a minute. So now we finish the Braita. Now the Gemara starts questioning something. Vidilma parim ve'elim vlav inu, va'akvasim inu ninu. Maybe you say the parim are separate. There's 2 for the musaf. There's 1 for the bread. There's 1 aisle for the musaf. There's 2 for the bread. But maybe the kvasim are the same. Maybe they're the same ones. So they say no. Now, since the parim switched and the elim switched, it must mean the kvasim are just different. That seems pretty clear. But now they say, wait a minute. Maybe you say parim ve'elim mimai de'ishtenu. Why do you assume that they're different? Maybe that they switch, 2 in one and 1 in the other. Maybe we're going to understand this completely differently. Maybe the Torah is saying, maybe the Torah says in one place 2 parim, 1 aisle, in the other place 1 par, 2 elim. To say, you want to bring two bulls, you can bring 2. You want to bring 1, bring 1. You want to bring 2 rams, bring 2. You want to bring 1, bring 1. Maybe that's why it flips it. They say no. Now they're going to have the final word here. Look at the order of the way it's brought. In Bamidbar, it says, bring an olah l'reach nichach, of what your olah made up of. Okay, this is the way the chart goes. 2 bulls, 1 ram, 7 sheep. But if you go look in Vayikra, I don't know if you noticed it, but it starts off with the sheep. 7 sheep, 1 bull, 2 rams. So because it switches the order, that tells you this is not the same as that. This is some completely new sacrifice. So now we learned that there's no overlap here. You bring this set of animals, even though they're very similar, the numbers that you bring and what animals you bring, but with minor differences, but you bring those with the bread, and this is a completely separate Musaf offering like all the other holidays have. Okay. Now we're going to go back to this Machloket, Rabbi Akiva, and Ben Nana. So we're going to finish up with this last chapter on the last chart on the page. So we have Rabbi Akiva who says the bread is going to be Ma'akev the sheep, and Ben Nana says it's the sheep that are Ma'akev the bread. Okay. So now the question is, where do they get this from? My time at Rabbi Akiva, we're going to have 2 basic answers from the psukim where he gets it from. Gamar Yihiyu Mitiyena. Okay, it really all comes from this pasuk at the end of that section. Vayikra, it says the Kohen should wave the lechem abikurim before God with the 2 kvasim. So notice the bread and the sheep are in that pasuk. Kodesh Yihiyu. Yihiyu means ma'akeh. It's essential. So now they say, what's essential? Is it the bread or the sheep? So Rabbi Akiva says, let's learn it from Tiena. Tiena is in the first pasuk there. Bring bread. Solet Tiena. Tiena, they're obviously talking about the bread. So malahalan lechem afkan lechem. So just like there it's bread, also here it's bread. Ben Nanas kamar yiyu yiyu. He says, what do you mean? It says yiyu in the pasuk 18, where it talks about the 7 sheep. And then it says yiyu, malahalan kvasim afkan kvasim. Just like there it's sheep, also here it's sheep. Ben Nanas nami. So now we're going to do a back and forth. Why does it Ben Nanas learn tiyena, nelef mi tiyena, malahalan lechem afkan lechem? So why doesn't Ben Nanas say tiyena and say it's bread? Why do you say sheep? Because we'd rather learn yiyu from yiyu. It's the same exact word. Rather than learn yiyumi tiena. Now, yiyumi tiena is the same root, but it's not the same word. So the Gemara says, "My nafka, but that's not a proof. Like, what's the difference? It doesn't matter if you change the root, as long as it's the same root. And in fact, we're going to show the classic Zera Sheva we always bring. We have a case like this. Hatana Rabbi Yishmael, v'shava kohen v'ba kohen. When it comes to the leper, it says when the Kohen comes after 7 days, not the leper's house, to check the house. If the house has leprosy, after the Kohen, they quarantine the house for 7 days. And then it says, Uba Kohen, he comes there. And if he sees it's leprous, he has to start taking out the stones and he has to replaster. He does a few actions. And then it says, but if not, he waits another 7 days, quarantines the house, comes back after 7 days, V'shava Kohen, he comes back. And when he comes back, what happens when if he sees it spread? It doesn't say in the Torah what to do. So what do they say? Zera Sheva, Zoe Shiva, Zoe Bia. Okay, the same thing. Whatever we did in the first, we're going to do in the second. So now, if we could say V'shavu Ba, we could definitely say Hayu Tiena. To which they say, no. Hanimile, that will work V'shavu Ba because there was no other choice. There was no better word. Hecha deleka dedamila. There was nothing similar to it. Aval hecha deika dedamila. But when there's something similar to it, we're obviously going to learn it for whatever's similar to it. Okay, so that was why doesn't Rabbi Ben Nanas learn from the pasuk of Rabbi Akiva? Now we have to say, why doesn't Rabbi Akiva learn yiyu and learn it from the sheep? The sheep is what's essential. Danim daval. So Rabbi Akiva nami leilaf mi yiyu. Why doesn't he learn that? Danim daval shematana lekohen mi daval shematana lekohen la fukehane de olot ninu. Well, why don't we learn bread from bread and not learn bread? Because bread is a matana l'kohen and the bread, right? These are the same, obviously, bread and bread. If we're going to learn it from somewhere, we're going to learn it from bread, which is just like it. But we're not going to learn it from a korban ola, which doesn't go to the kohen at all. The whole thing goes on the mizbeach. Okay, so that's option number 1 to explaining the machloket. Do you darshan yiyu or yiyu tiena? But the second option is ibait ema bikra gufe kamipalge. They're really arguing over the words in this pasuk kodesh yiyu. Because yiyu is the word that says it's essential, but the real critical part is LaHashem LaKohen. How do we understand LaHashem LaKohen? So now we're going to go down and see it on the chart. So Bikra Gufe Kamipalge. They're really arguing over the pasuk itself, the content of that pasuk, not where do we derive it from a different pasuk, but those words. Kodesh yeh LaHashem LaKohen. Rabbi Akiva Saval, Ezu Daval Shekulo LaKohen. Haveomer Zelechem. What does it say? Kodesh, it is for the Kohen. So Kodesh Rabbi Akiva, what goes completely to the Kohen? The bread. The sheep gets burnt on the altar, parts of it, right? And the blood goes on the altar. Some of it is to God. Uben Nana says, Miktiv Kodesh Yu La Kohen. It doesn't say Kodesh will be La Kohen. You skipped an important word. It says Kodesh Yu LaHashem LaKohen. To which he says, right, Kodesh Yu LaHashem LaKohen K'tiv. Ezu davar shemiksato LaHashem u'miksato LaKohen. He says, perfect proof for me. To God and to the Kohen. And therefore, perfect. The sheep part goes to the Kohen get to eat it because it's a shlamim. With shlamim, it's Kodesh Kodeshim, so it goes only to the Kohen. Normal shlamim are eaten by the owners. And it goes LaHashem also because parts get burned on the altar. So there's his proof. So now they say, right, Havei Omer, Elu Kfasim, those are the sheep. Rabbi Akiva, what's he going to say? Miktiv Kodesh Yet LaHashem Vila Kohen. It doesn't say for God and for the Kohen. So that's why he doesn't accept that reading. LaHashem LaKohen Ktiv, right? It says to Hashem, to the Kohen. What does that mean? So he's going to read it the way Rav Huna says. Kid Rav Huna, the Amar Rav Huna, Kena'o Hashem unitano LaKohen. It went to God, but God gives the Kohanim the rights to eat it. So basically, we're talking about something that goes completely to the Kohen. It just sort of goes through God on its way. Okay, so there's the end of our daf for today. We're now going to just do a quick review. We started with the Mishnah, the Parim, Elim, Fasim, and we said, which ones are we talking about? In the end, we said it's the ones in Vayikra. Okay, but we understood the Elim is really comparing the ones in Vayikra to the ones in Bamidbar. You can do one set without the other. With the Parim, it's talking about the two Parim actually that you bring in the Musafim are, if you don't bring one, right, it's okay. You can bring the other. And then we darshan that after. We saw where we saw that from as well. Right? We had the pasuk in Yechezkel where we got that you could bring just one par, you could bring one of the sheep. You don't have to bring all of them. And then we got from there to all sorts of contradictory psukim in Yechezkel. From there, we got back to Rabbi Shimon, who said if you from the Eifa pasuk where he learned that you have to bring the nesachim with it rather than bringing more bulls. And then we went to the Mishnah, the new Mishnah, where we said the parim, elim, and fasim, right, and the seir. None of those are essential for the bread, even though they're in the psukim with it. We darshaned how we got there in the Gemara, and we did say that there's this machloket about whether the bread and the two sheep offering, though, they in one direction, one precludes the other, but which direction? Rabbi Akiva and Ben Nanas have an argument, and we brought two different approaches as to where they get it from the psukim. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.